Soybean aphids. Darren, it's our old nemesis. And you know, it's funny because prior to about 13 years ago, we'd never even seen aphids before on our farm. And here we are 13 years later, and we've sprayed every single year at least once.
Well, I would say this, we had seen aphids, just not in soybeans. We'd seen some pea aphids in alfalfa and that kind of thing, and we'd seen a few aphids out in wheat and that kind of thing, but never in soybeans. Soybeans were such an easy crop. We just had some bean leaf beetles, and that was about it. All of a sudden, soybean aphids were just devastating yields.
Okay, so this is going back to something like 2004. There were a bunch of universities that got together and decided the economic threshold was going to be 250 aphids per plant. Since then, we've done a whole bunch of research and we found 250 aphids is probably quite a bit too high. And here's the other thing, since 2004, you look at what was our soybean price back then, half of what we have today. What was the cost of insecticide treatment? At least double what it is today. Insecticide's dirt cheap now, full rate for $2, it's nothing. And then besides that, we were back then getting 30, 40 bushel yields. Well, now on our farm, we're averaging close to 60 here in the last 5, 6, 8 years, something like that. So all the economics have totally changed, which means if we're talking about an economic threshold of when to spray, it is absolutely no longer 250 aphids per plant.
Well, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And it really, when I first started getting into agronomy, I would ask my dad all kinds of questions. And I said, Dad, I don't understand this threshold level for insects. He's like, all right, well, what are you asking about? And I said, well, so you're telling me I have to wait until I find 250 of these things sucking on every one of my plants out in my field, or on 80% of my plants, or whatever the threshold may be. I have to let all this damage happen first, then I can justify treating? He's like, well, that's what it's really saying. I'm like, doesn't it make a lot more sense to, oh boy, I see some numbers and they're growing. Let's get them on the early side and stop things.
But here's the thing. We don't want to go out there and kill a bunch of beneficials until we absolutely have to. So in other words, you might have a bunch of lady beetles out there and they could wipe your soybean aphids out. If let's say you only had one per plant and they eliminate these things, that's awesome. We don't have to spray. We save the $2 an acre we would have spent on insecticide. Okay, but the problem is if you get up to 10 or 15 or 25 or whatever it is, there's a tipping point there, and the beneficials, they're not going to catch up soon enough. So it was interesting. I think it was Purdue back a few years ago. They decided, oh, let's just let them go and see what happens. Well, the beneficials, they grew, their numbers grew, and eventually they eliminated all the soybean aphids. But when they got to the end of the season, they realized, uh-oh, our yield is significantly down. We can't wait and do that anymore. Well, the good news is a lot of these products can be tank mixed with other things. So you can tank mix the pyrethroids, for example, together with fungicide, together with foliar fertilizer, possibly. Make sure you're checking on all this stuff first. Try it out on a small scale before you do it on a big scale. Also, you can mix them with herbicide. But when it comes to Lorsban, that's where we get a little bit concerned. I don't like to see Lorsban mixed with fertilizer or with certain herbicides because you can end up with a little bit too much leaf burn. So just be a little cautious with that.
Well, there are so many products out there that you could potentially be spraying at this time. It's important to talk with whoever your dealer is in your area, because there may be a generic version of something that would normally mix just fine, but all of a sudden the generic has a little different formulation and you could have some issues. So just double check before you mix anything, and certainly do a jar test first before you mix things as well.
Yep, and one last thing, when you have any bug feeding on your crop, whether it's soybean aphids or something else, you are much more likely to have that crop getting disease. So that's where a fungicide will likely pay more than normal.
Well, unfortunately, killing all the bugs and stopping all the disease does nothing for our Weed of the Week. We'll show you what will stop it coming up next.